In the latest selection of Britain's top 10 mysteries, there is a crime that is recognized as the closest to perfect. And the development of the case is also very twists and turns. The investigators finally identified the victim, but suddenly found that he was still alive. There are always many mysteries. Even the police themselves said that, without the help of too many coincidences, they would have no chance of solving the case. However, this is just the beginning. As the investigation deepened, the police also found that behind Goodnight was also related to international case that had been Chen Feng for many years. The identity of the murderer is even more astonishing. So what exactly happened that year? And who was the murderer of Goodnight? Let's explore the sensational British case. To explore the murderer with multiple identities. On July 28, 1996, a fisherman named John Coppic, in the town of Brixham, Devon, England, was fishing. His luck was not good that day. He didn't catch much fish in several fishing nets, until he caught the fourth net. He felt a considerable weight, but when he pulled the net onto the fishing boat, he was scared and sat down on the ground directly. Because what he caught was not a full net of fish, but a rotting male corpse. He immediately called the police. After receiving the report, Devon police immediately arrived at the scene. According to the forensic examination, the victim was about 45 years old, and the time of death was at least a week. Although the victim's back of the head and buttocks had obvious trauma, the forensic doctor found a large amount of water in his lungs. This indicates that the victim was not dead before falling into the water, so the police couldn't determine whether this was a murder or not. Because the wounds on the victim were likely caused by hitting hard objects such as rocks, and this area has the longest coastline in the UK. Various accidents are not uncommon. There are also many people who committed suicide by jumping. So after this case happened, did not attract the police's special attention, but the identification of the victim is still necessary because the police have the responsibility to return the body to the family. But they never expected that. The most ordinary identity investigation, which later led to a series of strange things. According to the forensic examination, the victim had two obvious features. One is a snowflake-shaped tattoo on his body, but due to the long time he soaked in the sea, it was impossible to identify his original appearance, so it was difficult to identify his identity. Secondly, the victim was wearing a Rolex watch on his hand, with the time stopped at 6 days ago, which was 11:33 on July 22, 1996. According to the identification of professionals, the movement of this Rolex has a power reserve of 48 hours, so it can be concluded that the victim's real time of death should be on July 20, 1996. But the same clue can only help the police better determine the victim's time of death. It has no effect on identity verification, so they had to take the most stupid way to start checking the recent missing persons one by one. But it was still ineffective. Just as the Devon police were about to give up the investigation, a police officer found in a watch magazine found a way to identify the victim as a luxury brand, Rolex. When it was produced, each watch is given a serial number, just like a person's ID card, which is unique. This is the key basis for distinguishing authenticity. This means that if the watch on the deceased was genuine, it must also have a unique serial number. In this way, the police can rely on the serial number to track down the buyer's information. Finally, after expert identification, it was confirmed that the watch was genuine, and through the maintenance records, it shows that the watch was between 1977 and 1996. It was maintained 3 times, and the name left each time was the same, Mr. Pratt. Then the police, based on Mr. Pratt's last address information left, they found the apartment where he lived. But when they arrived here, the landlord told the police that Mr. Pratt had moved out on June 21st, had already moved out. However, the police did not gain nothing through the landlord's introduction. The police learned that Mr. Pratt's full name was Ronald Joseph Pratt. As for where Ronald went after that, and what he did for a living, the police knew nothing. 不过, the landlord still provided a very useful clue. When Ronald rented the house, the letter of recommendation he provided, and the recommender on it, was a man named David Davis. Then through the phone number on the letter, the police contacted the recommender named David. After receiving the call from David, the police was very enthusiastic, and he even put down his work, and immediately came to the police station to cooperate. David was dressed very casually at that time, but his clothes were well made. He looked like a rich and tasteful man. He spoke with a Native American accent, and he was easygoing. He always had a smile on his face when he spoke. He told the police a lot of information about Ronald, such as Ronald had been a soldier in 1960, and he longed for life in Canada. So much so that he tattooed the maple leaf pattern of Canada. That is when Ronald's body was found, the tattoo that looked like a snowflake on his body. Later, Ronald did fulfill his dream. He went to live in Canada. But because he was unfamiliar, he had some problems in life, so he returned to the UK. Then, with David's help, he found a house to stay temporarily. But at the end of June, Ronald suddenly decided to go to France to develop. He borrowed some money from David before leaving, and then there was no news of him. Meanwhile, Ronald was his very good friend. He was very sad about Ronald's death, so before leaving, he left his address. He said that if they needed any help in the future, please come to him. According to David's testimony, the police finally confirmed all of Ronald's travel plans were exactly the same as what David said. The police have almost confirmed that the body found at the seaside should be Ronald himself. But there is one thing that the police have always cared about. According to the clues they have now, Ronald was supposed to go to France on June 21st. But why did he die on July 20th? Murdered during this month, where he went. So the Sheriff Ian, who was in charge of the case out of that time, thought it necessary to restore Ronald, reconstruct his whereabouts for a month. Otherwise he couldn't close the case with peace of mind. So he decided to question David again. He called David several times, but he couldn't get through. In desperation, Sheriff Yan had to rely on the address left by David to go to his home in person. The address David left was the Little London farmhouse, but since the police were not familiar with the place, they mistook the house next door, the Little London house, but they didn't expect that. It was because of this accidental mistake, they accidentally discovered an important secret. When the police knocked on the door, an old man opened the door. But after learning the purpose of the police, he said that the farmhouse was next door, and the person living there was not David Davis, but Ronald Joseph Pratt. He moved here 3 years ago. He has a wife at least 20 years younger than him, and 2 daughters under 3 years old. According to the description of the neighbor, the Ronald who lives next door, the David who went to the police station before was the same person. The police, upon learning this, immediately had many thoughts. Could it be that the man named David, the real Ronald? But if David is Ronald, who was the person who died by the sea? Ronald and David are the same person. But no matter what the truth is, one thing is completely certain: there must be something else behind this case. So Sheriff Yan decided to investigate thoroughly. In the next period of time, the police collected information about and Ronald, David's information respectively. Immigration Bureau, Tax Bureau, departure records, loans, and bank records were verified one by one. During the verification, it was found David did exist, but only one record of leaving the country, and it was in 1945, when he was only in his 20s. But now, he should be at least over 70 years old. So the man who claimed to be David is obviously not the real David. To make the story more smooth, I will temporarily call him David. As for Ronald's records in the UK, the police have found a lot of records, and his experience is as David said. He left the UK and went to live in Canada. But a few months ago, he returned to the UK. Most importantly, later, the police confirmed through dental records that the body found on the beach was Ronald. This has been confirmed. This means that the man who claimed to be David was neither David nor Ronald. But what was his identity? The police could not find any clues. Even if they asked all of David's neighbors, no one knew his past occupation and income sources. They only knew that he was very rich and a luxury yacht. Obviously, this person's identity must be extraordinary, which made the police more determined to dig deeper. And as the investigation deepened, they found that David's wife's identity was also fake. Before taking her father's surname, her real name was Elaine Boss. And after hearing this name, the police immediately sensed something was wrong, because this name was the same as the victim Ronald's ex-girlfriend's name. Exactly the same. And the police were very sure that David's young wife was not the real Elaine. When they investigated Ronald before, the police already had some knowledge of Elaine. It was hard not to make the police suspect. There seemed to be some connection between them. Elaine was likely to be the key to solving all the mysteries. So the police immediately found the real Elaine to understand the situation. And the final result was as the police expected. Elaine told the police, between her, Ronald and David, there was indeed an unusual relationship. And as Elaine told the past 7 years ago, the ins and outs of the case finally began to emerge. According to the real Elaine, introduced that she met David in the summer of 1989. She was working at an auction house, and David was one of his clients. David was wearing a very expensive suit that day. and said as soon he wanted to buy a famous painting for investment. Then Elaine started to introduce the product to David. During the conversation, David recognized Elaine's work ability very much, so he threw out the olive branch before leaving and offered Elaine 3 times the salary. In the end, Elaine couldn't resist the temptation of quit her job and became David's employee. Later, she introduced her boyfriend, Ronald, to David. In this way, Ronald also became David's employee and soon fell in love with David. Because David has always been generous, he not only gave Ronald and Elaine high salaries, but also made them directly serve as company directors, giving them enough power and trust. And explained that he just didn't want his greedy ex-wife in America to claim alimony, so he put the company in their names. Although many of David's actions at that time also aroused the suspicion of Ronald and Elaine. For example, David always paid them in cash, and the money was deposited, which was known for its absolute secrecy. And for many years, David just asked them to go to various places to take photos of artworks, but they never saw David negotiate a deal. But soon Ronald and Elaine stopped doubting. First, David had a strong personal charm. He always looked elegant in public. And he was also a devout believer. Even the pastor praised him. It was impossible to be a dishonest person. What's more, at that time, both Ronald and Elaine were ordinary people with nothing. They couldn't imagine what they had that would be worth a rich man's pursuit. In the end, they both concluded they may not understand the world of the rich, so they chose to be obedient followers. In the next 3 years, David never asked Ronald and Elaine to do any unreasonable work, and never owed them wages. They completely let down their guard against David, but at this moment, David took the initiative to end the employment relationship. On Christmas Day in 1992, David sent Ronald and his friend a greeting card, saying it was their final gift. The content was that David would bear all the expenses for immigrating to Canada and give them an extra month's salary to help them settle in Canada. All along, immigrating to Canada has been the ultimate wish of Ronald and his wife. Now that their dream has come true, they were naturally overjoyed. So after expressing their gratitude to David, they decided to go to Canada in February 1993. Before I left, at David's request, they made a signature seal and left it behind. David's explanation at that time was that he could sign documents by himself and also save Ronald and his friend many troubles in the future. But they never thought that. Ronald just left. David took over his identity and started to present himself as Ronald, and David's young wife took over the identity of Ronald's girlfriend Elaine. Seeing this, I think many people have understood. The reason why David took such good care of Ronald is actually just to steal their identities, or create a reasonable and unexposed fake identity. Meanwhile, legally own a legitimate company. And in order to achieve this goal, he has been planning for 3 years. Through various means, he stole the private information of Ronald and Elaine and create a false persona. So after they left, David became the real Ronald in people's eyes. What he never expected was that Ronald couldn't adapt to life in Canada. 3 years later, he not only broke up but also returned to the UK. It's okay for Elaine to come back. After all, it was David's wife who took his identity, who had few social activities. But Ronald was different. According to Elaine, after Ronald returned to the UK, the thing he thought of was to return to Devon and prepare to continue working for David. But in this way, there would be 2 Ronalds in the same city. The deception will be exposed sooner or later. The police speculated that it was the real Ronald who discovered David's intention, or David was worried about the exposure, so he chose to kill Ronald. Only in this way can the problem be solved. When the police were considering whether to arrest David directly, David suddenly contacted Elaine, saying he wanted to have a cup of coffee with her. The time David made this call, just the day after Elaine came to the police station to be questioned the next day. This means that he probably already knew he was suspected. After the police decided not to let David go free anymore, because he was likely to destroy the evidence and even kill the informant Elaine again. So they immediately rushed to the farmhouse in London. In David's home, they found a large amount of gold bars and cash, whose value exceeded the income of ordinary people. Then they questioned David and his wife. But when questioned, David's wife remained silent. As for David, he was willing to tell everything. He didn't tell the truth. He still acted very calmly, as if he was sure that the police had no evidence to accuse him. Then he politely told the police that There must be some misunderstanding, and he would fully cooperate with the police investigation to clear up the misunderstanding. In short, the police asked but they didn't get any useful information. In desperation, the police decided to find out David's true identity first. After all, David took so much trouble to hide his identity. He was likely a wanted criminal. So they entered his fingerprints into the criminal database, but found that he had no criminal record at all, which shocked the entire police force. They really couldn't figure out, since he was not a wanted criminal, why did he hide his identity? Now there are two options for the police. One is to sue David for impersonating someone else, but the crime is not serious, although it is allowed to pay bail. It's easy to get out of jail. He is likely to escape at that time. Second is to prosecute David for the crime of murder. So the police have the right to detain him for 7 days. But the drawback is that the police must within a limited time find enough evidence to file a case. Finally, the police chose the latter, so they started to collect evidence in a hurry. In the next few days, the police mobilized all their forces. They questioned all witnesses over and over again, especially the place where the body was found, almost trampled by the police. As the saying goes, opportunity always favors the prepared. Finally, the police relied on a persistent spirit, and luck came to them again. Remember the man named John Kopic, who was the fisherman who found the body at the beginning? He has been fishing in that area for many years. Recently, he found a ship anchor at the same place. He fished up a ship anchor, but he never thought that it would be the key to solving the case. He just threw it aside. At this time, the police's persistence played a role. When the police went there to investigate for the nth time, the fisherman casually mentioned it, which made the police immediately alert, because the wounds on the victim were consistent with the marks left by the anchor. Finally, through forensic it was confirmed that the anchor was the murder weapon. So the police took this as a breakthrough. They finally found a series of decisive evidence. During the previous investigation, the police remembered David happened to have a yacht named Lady Jane. So the police speculated Ronald's real place of death was likely on David's yacht. But now no one knows where the yacht is. No one knows. However, it was a trainee police officer who was out at sea. He happened to find the Lady Jane on an island. Finally, after testing, it was found that there was a lot of Ronald's blood and hair. It confirmed that the yacht was the first crime scene. Meanwhile, the police also learned from the GPS on July 20th, 1996, the day Ronald died, this yacht had been in the area where the body was found. And according to David's consumption records, on July 8th, he also bought an identical anchor. Combined with the above evidence, it is enough to prove David was the murderer of Ronald. So the police charged David officially with murder. Arrested David. But then, the most dramatic scene in the history of crime occurred. With evidence, and the murderer was caught. But surprisingly, the police still didn't know the identity of the murderer, since David spoke fluent American English. The British police sent David's fingerprint information. Also sent a copy to the US police, but still didn't get any useful information. But the police did not give up. Then, they sent a copy to every English-speaking country, sent a copy of the information about David, and also sent a copy to Interpol. Finally, their efforts paid off and finally received a reply from Interpol. It turned out that the man who called himself was actually an international wanted criminal from Canada. Meanwhile, and the second most wanted international criminal, named Albert Johnson Walker. He was a financial fraudster. He was born in Ontario, Canada in 1946. He was a devout Christian. Growing up, Albert's impression on people, he was a kind and gentle, which also laid a solid foundation for his future foundation. In early 1980, 34-year-old Albert, he founded a company called Walker Financial Services, attracting people to deposit money with low input and high returns. His company, which is a well-known Ponzi scheme. But the people at that time did not understand the trick, plus his image and his reputation was always well known. Therefore, many people began to deposit money in his company. Finally, even Americans, British, French, and other citizens from other countries also became his clients. Albert quickly opened 6 branches. Money kept coming in like a snowball and kept flowing into his pocket. But we all know that business, once the capital chain breaks, it will easily be completely shattered, and history has proved it was bound to happen sooner or later. So in 1990, Albert, who had anticipated the crisis, took all the clients' money with his second daughter. When the Canadian police reacted, they had already disappeared, and the second daughter who was taken away was his nominal wife. Although over the years, police from various countries have been trying to find him, and issue international arrest warrants. But for many years, there has been no result because Albert is very good at disguising himself by changing hairstyles, beards, and clothing. He can change his image greatly. Moreover, his language skills are also very strong. He not only speaks many languages, but also dialects. Therefore, his identity can be switched without a trace. He can be American, British, French, or Canadian. More importantly, Albert is also very good at stealing identities. Ronald is the best proof of this. This time, when Albert carried out a criminal plan in the UK, there were too many coincidences. He would probably still be at large. Just imagine if it weren't for the Rolex on the victim's body. To verify his identity, if Ronald hadn't gone to Canada and came back, if the police hadn't gone to the wrong door during the visit, if the fisherman hadn't coincidentally salvaged the murder weapon, if someone happened to find Mrs. Jian, could this case have been solved? Albert calculated that DNA was just beginning and perfectly exploited the data synchronization gap. He also relied on his meticulous and his near-perfect disguise. He deceived everyone. It seemed that everything was under his control, but he never expected that. He finally lost to the gears of fate. When all the coincidences come together, no matter how good you are at calculating, you still have no chance of winning. Perhaps this is the best manifestation of good and evil.